The sun was relentless that afternoon, almost making the asphalt melt beneath Matthew's feet. He had just taken the back road connecting the city to his mansion, hoping to get home before the heat became unbearable. But nature seemed to have other plans. With a dull thud, the front tire exploded, and within seconds Matthew found himself stranded in the middle of nowhere, on an empty road, without cell service and no soul in sight. "Great. Wonderful," he muttered, pressing his lips together as he looked at the flat tire. He popped the trunk, trying to stay calm, but the scorching heat only worsened the situation. The last thing he wanted was to waste hours there, waiting for a tow truck that probably wouldn't pass by that stretch of road anytime soon. With a frustrated sigh, he began attempting to turn the lug wrench, but quickly realized he had no idea what he was doing. What did he know about changing tires? Practically nothing. He could barely open the hood of his car without the mechanic's help. So when he heard a sound coming from the direction of the road, he couldn't help but tense up. Boy. He looked about 13 years old, skinny, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that covered almost his entire face. What was a boy doing alone on such a remote road? Matthew didn't like the idea of someone approaching. These days, anyone could be an opportunist, waiting to take advantage of a stranger. The boy didn't seem threatening at first glance, but no. One just appeared out of nowhere in a place like that without raising a few red flags. "Need some help?" The boy's voice, soft and carefree, broke Matthew's thoughts. He was approaching, walking briskly without hesitation. Matthew grew suspicious. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously, studying the boy. "You're a long way from home." "For a place like this?" "I live around here," the boy replied, seemingly unfazed by the clear distrust in Matthew's voice. "I can help you change the tire." "I didn't ask for help," Matthew shot back, his voice colder. "And do you know what you're doing? I'm not one to accept help from strangers." The boy shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "If you don't want help, fine. I just thought it would be quicker. I know what I'm doing." He bent down to examine the tire, completely ignoring Matthew's curt tone. The strangest thing was that, watching the boy move with such ease, loosening the bolts and fitting the lug wrench into place, Matthew had to admit there was something different about Elijah. The boy's confidence, his skill, even his calm demeanor in handling the situation. It was almost as if he had been born on that road, among the deserted paths. "Do you really know what you're doing?" Matthew asked skeptically. "No offense, but a boy like you, why would you be alone here? What are you doing on such a remote road?" Elijah looked at him, a hint of pity on his face. "Why wouldn't I be? What's so strange about it?" His voice was gentle, but his unwavering gaze was firm, almost challengingly innocent. Matthew furrowed his brow. "Aren't you scared being alone out here?" "No," Elijah answered without hesitation, as if the idea of fear were completely foreign to him. "I'm more useful this way." "And you, sir? Are you afraid to ask for help?" That response caught Matthew off guard, and he swallowed hard. For a moment he felt uncomfortable, as if the boy were sizing him up more than Matthew was evaluating Elijah. "Well, I'm not afraid," Matthew replied, trying to regain confidence in his own posture. "But it's nice to know there are still people who care. So, what do you think? Are you going to help me or not?" Elijah simply nodded, and without another word, crouched down to continue the work. He did everything so efficiently, with such skill, that Matthew could no longer doubt his competence. The boy changed the tire with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, and Matthew, to his dismay, felt powerless there, watching. When the tire was changed, Elijah stood up and wiped his hands. All done. This should last. Until a gas station. Matthew looked at the boy, still suspicious, but with a strange sense of gratitude mixed with curiosity. "You don't want anything in return? Not even a thank you for being so efficient?" Elijah gave a subtle smile but didn't seem bothered by the compliment. "Helping others is the right thing to do, sir. I don't do it for recognition. That's just what people do when they're a little embarrassed to be selfish." Matthew felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. The boy didn't want anything, didn't even accept a small reward. He was facing someone who seemed to understand generosity and humility more than many adults he knew. "You're a good boy, Elijah," Matthew said, thinking more about what he'd said than what he'd done. "I'm not good," Elijah replied with a slight smile as he began to walk back down the road. "I just know how to do what's right." And suddenly, as the boy walked away, Matthew was left with the feeling that this unexpected encounter had stirred something deeper inside him, something he couldn't quite comprehend yet. But one thing was certain. Elijah was not the kind of boy you meet every day. Matthew Evans's house was enormous, with marble walls and windows so tall they seemed to touch the sky. Luxury was in every corner, from the Persian rug beneath his feet to the gold clock that marked the rhythm of his life. But as he entered his house that night, something didn't feel right. The mansion, usually comforting, felt empty in a way he couldn't explain. The echo of his steps on the polished wooden floors sounded like a distant reminder of comfort he had lost, but never really knew when. He let himself fall onto the couch, his shoulders heavy as though they were carrying the weight of the entire world. Dinner was on the table, but he barely noticed the smell of the food. The only thing his mind seemed to be able to process was Elijah's face. The boy. The strange encounter on that empty road. The generosity without expecting anything in return. Why couldn't he stop thinking about Elijah? That attitude of his, so pure and selfless, seemed to still resonate inside him. Matthew knew that after so many years of living for work and responsibilities, it wasn't easy to be impressed by someone. But the boy had done it, in a way he couldn't understand. He looked at the emptiness of the room, as if the answers might be there. And then, without warning, he stood up, grabbed his phone, and with a simple motion began searching for something that would connect him more to Elijah. He typed the name of the small town where the boy lived, Harlan, Kentucky. He didn't quite know what he was looking for, but something was driving him to know more. Something beyond simple curiosity. A feeling that there was a story there he needed to understand. What he found was simple, but revealing. Harlan, a small town of just over 1,500 residents, marked by financial struggles and a history of hard work. It wasn't the kind of place Matthew usually found himself, but still, in some way, it felt familiar. What could the boy be doing there, amidst all the hardships? What had shaped him to be so different, so mature for his age? With his face still illuminated by the phone screen, Matthew let out a deep sigh. He had no idea where all this would lead, but a strange feeling of necessity drove him forward. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just let the memory of that encounter fade away like so many others in his life. Matthew wasn't exactly sure what he expected to find in Harlan, but as he arrived in the small town, it immediately became clear that everything there was a stark contrast to the life he knew. The first thing that caught his attention was the silence. Not the kind of comfortable silence you find in an isolated place or the stillness of the night, but a dense, almost tangible silence. It was as though the town, the people, and even the wind breathed a heavier air. There was a sense that life there wasn't easy, but somehow it still continued. He stopped the car in front of the simple wooden house he had seen in his research. The place wasn't large or beautiful, but somehow there was something inviting about it. The windows were covered with simple curtains, and the garden was, at best, disorganized, yet it seemed well kept, as if each plant and flower had been carefully chosen, even under difficult circumstances. Before stepping out of the car, Matthew took a deep breath. He was heading toward something he knew would change his perspective. But at the same time, there was something inside him. A knot. A tension he couldn't explain. He wasn't used to this kind of environment, to this reality so far removed from his own. When Elijah appeared at the door, it was as if he had been expecting him. The boy, at 13, with that calm smile, didn't show any signs of nervousness, as though he already knew exactly what was about to happen. Elijah's house was simple, but there was an aura of dignity surrounding it. The way he carried himself there, amidst so much simplicity, didn't seem like someone who accepted poverty with sadness, but rather as part of his story. "Hi again, Mr. Evans," Elijah said, once again with that unchanging, calm tone, as if time here moved differently, slower, more unperturbed. "Hi, Elijah," Matthew replied, trying to hide the tension in his voice. "Is your mom home?" "Yes, of course. I'll take you to her." Elijah stepped aside, opening the door a little more for Matthew to pass through. Upon entering, Matthew was immediately struck by the smell of homemade food hanging in the air. Something simple, perhaps rice and beans with pork, just the kind of meal that could warm the soul. He couldn't help but notice how different the house felt. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in a wealthy town, but there was a human warmth here that seemed to radiate from every corner, from the simple yet inviting sofa to the photographs on the walls showing a family that struggled but never seemed to lose hope. "Have a seat," said Marie, Elijah's mother. She was in the kitchen with a tired but strong expression. She was a simple woman, but with a presence so commanding that, without saying a word, she seemed to dominate the space. She was stirring something in a cast-iron pot, and her arms, marked by years of hard work, were steady, though there was a slight tremor, as if life had asked more of her than anyone should bear. "Thank you for having me," Matthew said, settling into the living room, unsure of what more to say. Marie didn't respond immediately. She just continued stirring the pot, as if she were considering Matthew's presence there. He knew she was sizing him up, deciding whether or not she could trust him. It wasn't an easy decision. After all, he was a stranger in her home. "I know why you're here," Marie finally spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but clear. She didn't seem surprised, but there was a cautious tone to her words. "Elijah told me about what happened with the tire. Thank you for helping my son, but I know it's not just out of kindness." Matthew felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He tried to mask his discomfort, but it was impossible to ignore that this woman was seeing right through him. She knew he wasn't there just out of gratitude. There was something in her voice, something that made him realize that even without knowing everything about her, she knew enough about life to recognize when someone was hiding something. I'm here because I don't understand," Matthew said, finally letting the words out. "I want to understand how a boy so young like Elijah can be so generous without expecting anything in return. I've never encountered that before, and it's left me curious." Marie stopped what she was doing and looked at him. There was a pause in the air, as if she was evaluating the sincerity of his words. The silence that followed was heavier than any verbal response could have been. Matthew felt the growing tension, but he didn't know how to stop. There was something there, something bigger that he needed to understand. "He was raised that way," Marie finally said, her voice firm, but with a tone of melancholy Matthew couldn't quite interpret. "Life's never been easy for us. And Elijah, well, he grew up knowing that life can give you little, but there's always something you can give back. He learned to give because that's all he's seen from me. And he learned to be good because it's the one thing no one can take from him." Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. Marie's words hit him hard. He felt small in the presence of this woman, who, despite everything she had faced, had still managed to raise a child who seemed to understand more about generosity than anyone he knew. "I didn't mean to be intrusive," Matthew said, more to himself than to her. "I just felt like maybe I could help. But now I see that maybe I'm trying to understand something that has no explanation." Marie looked at him, her expression softer but still cautious. "You can try to understand whatever you want, Mr. Evans, but in the end you'll realize it's not about understanding. It's about accepting, and sometimes that's what life asks of us. To accept what life gives us and give our best, even when what we have to offer seems little." Matthew sat in silence, absorbing her words. There, in the middle of a simple home, and a woman who, despite the hardships, still kept a flicker of hope alive, he realized that maybe he had been looking for answers in the wrong place. It wasn't about giving something material or seeking logical explanations. It was about something much deeper, something that transcended the logic of his life up until then. Elijah's house was quiet that day. The silence in the air felt heavier than usual, as if it were waiting for something. Matthew, however, could no longer ignore the sense of urgency he felt. The conversations with Marie, the glances exchanged. With Elijah, everything was beginning to form a web of thoughts in his mind. He knew he couldn't just leave and go back to his life as it had been before. As much as he tried to be cautious, he couldn't get the image of Elijah's simple, cramped house out of his head. The way the light came through the windows, the smell of old wood, and the sense of suffocation that seemed to reflect all the limitations those walls faced. That house wasn't just a physical space. It was a reflection of that family's doing, a cramped space full of challenges, where dreams seemed to be squeezed into dark and forgotten corners. Matthew knew that, with his resources, he could change that. Not in an extravagant or imposed way, but something more subtle, something that offered more than just material comfort, a real chance for a new beginning. Perhaps that was the only way to ease the discomfort he felt about Elijah's act of kindness. He needed to act in a meaningful way. In the following days, Matthew began to devise a plan. He didn't want to just paint the walls or replace the furniture. What he was planning was deeper. He wanted to transform Elijah's house into a space that was more than just a physical refuge, but a symbol of a new life. He wanted to give this family the chance to live without the constant pressure of surviving. He started making the first calls. He hired a local architect and some workers. Matthew knew the budget would be tight, but he wanted to involve people from Harlan's own community. He believed that if he was going to do something, it should be done genuinely, without the pretense of showing power or superiority. This wasn't an act of charity. He wanted the people of the town to see the change not as something imposed from the outside, but as a reflection of unity and collective effort. When the workers started arriving, Matthew made sure to be there, the whole time. He wanted to see every detail, to ensure that what he imagined was transformed into reality. The house would need much more than simple renovations. The windows would be replaced with larger panes to allow more light in. The walls would be repainted, and the roof reinforced. The living space would have a more solid floor, and the kitchen, which was slowly falling apart, would get new cabinets and appliances. But it wasn't just that. Matthew also thought of something that would go beyond the structure. He wanted to include something that would represent more of Elijah's family essence. He thought of a small garden, with simple flowers and plants that could add a touch of life and color to the space. He wanted the space to reflect what was inside the people who lived there, resilient but capable of blooming, even in the toughest conditions. However, the process wasn't simple. Over the days, Matthew faced several difficulties. There were moments when the workers were late, or the budget exceeded what was expected. Some issues started raising doubts in his mind. He wondered if he was doing this for the right reasons. Was he really helping? Or was he just trying to ease his own guilt for having been so distant from the reality of people like Elijah and his mother? Every time he returned to Elijah's house, he felt Marie's gaze on him, as if she were measuring his intentions. She knew something was going on, knew he had a plan, but she still didn't know exactly what he wanted. Her distrust was palpable, and no matter how much he tried to mask it, Matthew felt she didn't completely believe in the goodness of his actions. He tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, but there was something about the way she watched him that made him question. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked one afternoon as he adjusted some newly hung curtains. The question was direct, without pretense. It wasn't accusatory, but Matthew felt the weight of it. He didn't know how to respond. For a moment he looked at her, searching for an answer, but the words didn't come. He felt out of place, as if his actions were being scrutinized not only by her, but by himself as well. "I just want to help," he finally answered, with a sincerity that, at that moment, sounded almost fragile. Marie fell silent, but her gaze spoke more than any words could. She knew the help came from a genuine place, but she also knew that Matthew's gesture wouldn't be the end. He would need to learn to live with what he was doing, and perhaps understand the true meaning of helping. The project continued. The following days, Matthew spent more time in Harlan, frequently visiting Elijah's house. During these moments, he began to see the family in a different light. He was no longer just an observer. Now he felt like part of that small world, touched by Marie's quiet resilience and Elijah's unwavering kindness. Elijah, now 13, began to open up a bit more with Matthew. Not about his feelings or the difficulty of living in a modest house, but about how he saw the world. He talked about his simple dreams, like having a garden full of flowers just like Matthew wanted, or how he wished to see Harlan more cheerful and less lost in the shadows of poverty. Their conversation was genuine, without haste, and Matthew felt he was being invited into a universe he would never have known, if not for that act of helping the day the tire blew. Each visit Matthew made to Elijah's house began to transform the meaning he attributed to that journey. He was no longer just there to help. He was learning, discovering something his life of wealth and success had never offered him, the importance of truly connecting with others. The transformation was happening, not only in Elijah's house but also inside Matthew. The sound of hammers and saws no longer filled the air as it once had. Elijah's house was finally taking shape. The hard work of the past few months was beginning to bear fruit, and though there were still details to be worked out, Matthew could already see what he had imagined coming to life. Where the crumbling walls had been, there were now new coverings and soft colors. The floor, once creaky, was now solid and firm. The windows let in more light, filling each room with a gentle warmth. But for Matthew, the most impressive thing wasn't the freshly painted walls or the new floors. What truly touched his soul was the visible shift in the atmosphere of the house. The sense of tightness and scarcity was giving way to a new lightness, as though the house itself had opened up to the world, like a flower blooming after a long wait. And more importantly, it was the transformation happening within the people who lived there. Marie, who had once eyed everything Matthew did with suspicion, now walked through the house with a quiet smile on her lips. She didn't need to say much. Her gratitude was in the subtle gestures, the way she organized things, as if the new space was finally worthy of her dreams. She still had doubts, of course, doubts that Matthew felt deep in his stomach, but there was something different now, something that indicated she might be starting to accept that he was truly there to help them from the heart. On the other hand, Elijah was different. Matthew saw him more often now, not just when he was delivering materials or checking the progress of the work. They began to talk more without haste, more naturally. The house seemed to be a meeting place where the two of them could connect honestly, without the distractions of the outside world. "Did you really do all of this for our house?" Elijah asked, his look full of disbelief. It was clear that, for him, the idea of someone so distant from their reality, someone with so much power and resources, wanting to invest time and money in something as simple as their house was almost incomprehensible. Matthew felt a slight pressure in his chest as he heard that question. He knew he wasn't there just to renovate a house. His gesture, though selfless in essence, touched something deeper. He was trying to give back something that couldn't be measured in money, something he didn't quite know how to explain until that moment. How could he explain to Elijah that by doing all of this, he was seeking to find a part of himself he thought he had lost? "I didn't just renovate your house, Elijah," Matthew replied softly, almost as if he was considering his words before speaking. "I did it because, deep down, I needed to see what it really meant to change something, not just for you, but for me too." The boy looked at him, confused, as if trying to comprehend something beyond the obvious. But instead of asking more, he simply nodded and returned to his corner, as though absorbing the words silently. Matthew realized that for Elijah, the concept of help was much deeper than any donation or act of charity. The way the boy lived and saw the world seemed shaped by raw honesty and quiet resilience, not by grand gestures or empty promises. As the work neared completion, the sense of change was tangible in the air. Marie, though still cautious, began to open up a little more. She was accepting the transformation, but she did so carefully, like someone who didn't want to take anything for granted. Maybe somewhere deep inside she knew this gesture wasn't just about a house. It was about the beginning of something new, something she had never known could exist. On Matthew's last visit, just before the work was officially completed, He found himself with Marie and Elijah in the living room, which now displayed a comfortable but simple ambiance. The new furniture was in place. The fresh paint on the walls gave an air of renewal, but what really mattered was the cozy silence that filled the house. Matthew stood there, in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Something inside him had transformed. More than just the house, more than just the walls. He had touched something much deeper than he had imagined. Marie entered the room and looked around, running her fingers over the clean surfaces as if testing reality. She stopped in front of Matthew, her eyes fixed on his. I don't know how to thank you," she finally said, but there was something in her voice, something different from what Matthew had expected. It was a mixture of acceptance and humility, but also something more, something he could barely identify. The gratitude wasn't just for the house, but for the change that was beginning to take form. A quiet but powerful change inside all of them. "You don't need to thank me," Matthew responded, his voice firmer now. "I've learned more from you than I ever imagined." Boo! The silence that followed was comfortable, like a pause between two heartbeats. Matthew looked at Elijah, who was sitting in a corner of the room, his eyes brighter than before. He knew that the boy, with his unwavering kindness, had so much more to teach him than he could ever teach him. In that moment, Matthew realized that the true transformation wasn't in the things he had given. It was in what he was beginning to understand about himself, about the world, and about what truly mattered in life. When he finally said his goodbyes, he felt an inner peace he had never experienced before. He was leaving behind a renovated house, but more importantly, he was carrying with him the certainty that true wealth wasn't found in walls or comfort, but in the bonds that are formed in the small things, in acts of kindness, and in the reciprocity of souls that meet.